scourge of the Flagellants. Blood, whips, and madness. In the heart of the 14th century, as Europe groaned beneath the weight of pestilence and despair, there arose a movement that was as bloody as it was fanatical. They called themselves the Flagellants, and their gospel was not of peace or comfort but of pain, scourging, and madness. They marched barefoot through towns and villages, their bodies naked to the waist, their skin flayed raw by whips studded with iron. With every step they struck themselves, raining down blows until their backs ran red with blood, until the earth was splattered with the gore of their devotion. Where the Black Death swept, the Flagellants followed, their cries of repentance mingling with the stench of decay, their ritual of suffering spreading terror as surely as the plague itself. To understand them is to step into a world collapsing. The Black Death had begun its grim harvest. Cities lay in ruin, corpses piled in pits, churches overflowed with funerals. Priests fled, physicians confessed helplessness, and prayers seemed to rise only to fall unanswered. In this void, the Flagellants appeared, proclaiming that the plague was God's punishment upon mankind, that only through blood and agony could his wrath be appeased. They were not clergy, not sanctioned by the church, but common men, merchants, peasants, craftsmen, who abandoned their homes, took up whips, and marched in great processions that snaked across Europe like rivers of suffering. They moved in silence until the ritual began. At appointed times, in market squares or churchyards, they would strip to the waist, form a circle, and fall to the ground, crying out their sins. Then, rising as one, they began the scourging. The whips they carried were no simple cords. They were leather thongs tipped with iron spikes or knotted with sharp bits of bone. With rhythmic strikes, they lashed their own flesh, beating until skin split, until rivulets of blood streamed down to soak their trousers and drip onto the cobblestones. Some struck themselves on the chest, some on the back, others across their thighs, until their entire bodies were canvases of gore. And all the while they chanted hymns of penance, voices raw with fervor, eyes wild with fanatic light. Crowds gathered to watch. Some came in awe, believing the Flagellants holy men whose blood would intercede with God. Others came in fear, disturbed by the frenzied spectacle, yet unable to turn away. Mothers brought children, pressing their little ones to the edge of the square, hoping a drop of the blood might ward off the plague. Merchants sold relics, pieces of whip, scraps of bloody cloth as talismans. Yet behind the spectacle, there was a growing unease, for the Flagellants preached not hope but doom. They denounced priests as corrupt, declared the Pope powerless, claimed that only through their blood sacrifice could mankind be spared. In their sermons, there was fire and fury, an apocalyptic vision that infected the crowd as surely as disease. The movement spread like wildfire. From Germany into the Low Countries, into France, into Bohemia, thousands joined. They traveled in groups of hundreds, sometimes thousands, columns of bleeding men snaking through villages like a tide of flesh. They slept in barns or beneath the stars, ate from the hands of those who revered them, and left behind trails of blood. At night, the sound of their chanting carried on the wind, and villagers awoke to the sight of pale, scarred figures limping into the square, preparing to bleed again. It was said that in some towns, the streets ran red for days after their passage, stones dark with the stains of their sacrifice. But with their blood came madness. The Flagellants became not only zealots but mobs. Convinced that the plague was caused by sin, they began to seek sinners to punish. They turned their whips on others, drunkards, adulterers, gamblers, lashing them in public as offerings to God. They singled out Jews, already persecuted and accused of poisoning wells, dragging them from homes to be beaten and killed. In Strasbourg, Mainz, and other cities, flagellant mobs became butchers, slaughtering entire communities in frenzied pogroms. Blood was their gospel, and it mattered not if it came from their own backs or the throats of others. Their rituals grew darker. Chroniclers describe nights when flagellants gathered in torchlight, their bodies dripping red, chanting until they foamed at the mouth, their whips striking in rhythm like drums of war. Some claimed to see visions. Angels, demons, the Virgin Mary weeping blood. Others fell into trances, speaking prophecies of fire and doom. There were whispers that Satan walked among them, disguised as a bleeding man, leading them deeper into frenzy. Towns awoke to find corpses in the fields where the flagellants had passed, their deaths unexplained save for the terror of the procession. The church at first tolerated them. After all, here were men preaching repentance, calling people to turn from sin. But soon the flagellants became rivals to priests, drawing larger crowds, undermining authority, spreading doctrines of despair and defiance. The Pope at Avignon condemned them as heretics, declaring their processions blasphemy. Yet the condemnation only fueled their fervor. They declared themselves above Pope and priest alike, vessels of God's will, chosen to bleed for the sins of mankind. And so they marched on. But wherever they went, the plague followed. Their gatherings became breeding grounds for pestilence, their blood rituals spreading infection. In some cities, it was said that more died after the flagellants arrived than before. People began to fear them, to whisper that they were cursed, that their blood was not sanctified but poisoned. Doors were bolted against them. Towns turned them away. Yet still they came, relentless in their scourging, relentless in their madness. Imagine the sight at the height of their terror. 1,000 men in rags, pale as corpses, backs flayed to ribbons, blood gleaming in torchlight. The air thick with the stench of sweat, iron, and rot. Their chants echoing through the night, their whips striking flesh in unison like thunder. Eyes rolled back in ecstasy, mouths frothing with fanatic cries. Behind them, a trail of corpses, both plague victims and those beaten to death in their fury. This was not a movement of salvation but of doom, a death cult draped in the robes of piety, and it left Europe quaking. Their decline came swiftly, as madness always does. Excommunicated, hunted by authorities, the flagellants dissolved into smaller bands. Some disappeared into forests, continuing their bloody rites in secret. Others were arrested and hanged, their bodies left to rot as warnings. By the 15th century, they were largely gone, remembered only as a dark frenzy of blood and terror that had stalked the plague years. Yet their image endured in woodcuts, in chronicles, in whispered tales of the time when men scourged themselves raw and spilled their blood in the belief that pain could turn the hand of God. But the horror remains vivid. To imagine them is to imagine a Europe already drowning in death, made darker by men who turned their flesh into a spectacle of suffering. The crack of whips, the gush of blood, the frenzied chants, the mobs turned murderous, the roads slick with gore. These are the memories of the flagellants. Not saints, not saviors, but zealots who transformed faith into madness, who made the body not a temple but an altar of torment. In their story we see the darkest truth of the medieval world, that in times of fear, when death stalks the earth, men will grasp at anything, even the lash, even blood, even madness itself. The flagellants were both victims and executioners, consumed by terror, driven to frenzy, and remembered as one of the most gruesome spectacles the Middle Ages ever birthed. And in the silence of the night, if one listens closely, perhaps one can still hear the echo of their chants, the crack of their whips, the drip of their blood upon the stones. A ghostly procession that never truly ended, a scourge of blood, whips, and madness.